Live at 5, happy hour. Welcome everybody to the ETF Think Tank. Today we're going to be talking about fusion, a subject near and dear to my heart. Well, it is actually. I'm thrilled that Klaas de Boer is here calling in from London to educate us all. I'm Dan Weisskopf, ETF Think Tank, lead ETF strategist and ETF professor. Got a lot of handles there. So anyway, with that, I'm going to hand it off to, I guess, Cynthia, because she's to the left of me.
Hey, everybody, Cynthia Murphy, head of research for the ETF Think Tank. Always excited to be here on our happy hours. Today's conversation, it's way out of my depth, so I can't wait to see all the stuff I'm going to learn. It's part sci-fi, part reality, as Venuto was telling her before the call. So we're excited you guys are here to join us for this. Thanks for being with us, Klaas.
David?
Go, David or Mike, whoever wants to go next.
How's it going, everyone? David Chikansky here, fellow portfolio manager with this group. I focus on the SoFi Be Your Own Boss Gig Economy ETF, as well as the Inflation Fighting ETF, none of which invest in fusion, because that's not investable, as we will learn shortly. But who knows in the future if that might change. I'll kick it off to our CIO and founder, Mike Venuto.
Hey folks, Mike Venuto here. I'm going to start off as the host, and then I'm going to be exiting early and listening to a replay of this later because our daughter is being inducted in the National Junior Honor Society tonight, and I can't miss that for a happy hour. So I am real excited about today because, you know, usually we're in here talking investments, and we tend to know something about that. The last 15-20 minutes of the pre-show where we're talking with Klaas, I am amazed how little I knew. I made myself sound terrible talking about particle accelerators and super colliders and thinking that they had anything to do. I mean, I've already been schooled, and I look forward to really great questions and having a great subject matter expert. We do like to have a drinking word, because we don't want to be too serious. So neutron, I think that's the neutral proton, I guess, or that's, I don't know.
Can anybody use that in a sentence? Yeah. That's how deep we're going today.
Yeah, it's pretty much. So with that, why don't you take it away, Klaas? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what the hell is fission? Fusion. Fission actually happens. We have bombs and we have power. What is fusion?
Fusion also happens because without fusion, none of us would be sitting here. We have a very large, nice fusion power plant, 150 million kilometers from us in the form of the sun. And that is sort of daily proof of fusion happening. Klaas de Boer, I think, Dan, the best way to make the connection is a summer friend from Quag. And Dan was kind enough to invite me to talk about fusion today. I am a physicist, engineering physicist by training from Delft in the Netherlands, but I've been living in London for the last 20 years, father of two. Wife is American, that's where the link to the US sits. And as a physicist, I sort of upon graduation went straight to the dark side, joined McKinsey in Amsterdam and briefly in Russia, but left McKinsey in the sort of end of the 90s to enter venture capital, and have been in that space more or less ever since. Fusion, first as a teenager, was something in the science magazines, something you read about. There was quite a bit of investment going into fusion in the 70s after the first oil crisis. That's when sort of real investment in fusion started. As a student, I visited a building that was under construction in the UK, which is very close to what you see behind me, which is not yet built, but it's going to be built right next to JET, the sort of world's most advanced fusion machine, most advanced tokamak that has been built and operated so far. At university, there were two fusion events. One was the announcement from, I think was the University of Utah, about cold fusion, which proved not to work. But also the largest oil company in the Netherlands, Shell, actually invested into a fusion startup in the Netherlands in the 80s, which failed spectacularly. And I think the institutional memory is very long, and they're still reluctant to get back into fusion. But when I was working in venture in 2007, I told Dan this, having a pint in a pub in London with a former McKinsey colleague from Amsterdam who was working in Vancouver and had launched a clean tech fund in Vancouver, and said that his colleague had put some seed money with a few friends into a private fusion company. I couldn't resist temptation and got on a plane to Vancouver to find out what this was, because I didn't think that this was sort of at all a venture that was investable for clean tech VCs, but it proved out it was, and that led to our fund joining a syndicate in 2009, investing in General Fusion. I joined the board of General Fusion in 2009. Have been on that board ever since. In the end of 2019, I became an independent director. Our fund, separate story, won't go into that today, went a different direction, became an independent director of the company, and since the middle of 2020, so early in the pandemic, they asked me to chair the company. So I've been involved with General Fusion as one of the first private fusion companies since 2009.
Okay, since I'm not going to get to stay long, I'm getting my first question in here, and then you guys can take over. So in the pre-call, you were talking to us about what is that business, right? Like, so in the background, like we're all at the pub, but you're at the facility that you're building right now, which you're saying could be on 2027. What is that facility? What is your background? What is the business case? Like you said, you did it through a fund, so obviously somebody wants to make money at some point. So tell us the story.
Yeah. So the opportunity and challenge in the energy transition is enormous. So the price at the end of the road for fusion is phenomenal. General Fusion has so far raised about $300 million. And is one of sort of a handful of leading players in the space. All in all, there are about somewhere between 50 and 100 private fusion companies out there today. Collectively have raised about $5 billion. And what General Fusion is working on is commercially available fusion energy. A lot of work in fusion historically has been scientific projects, but our company was founded by Michel Laberge in Vancouver in 2002 with only one aim, and that is to produce commercially viable fusion power. The machine that you see to my right behind me on, there we go, on that side, is a fusion demonstration plant. It is not a power plant, but it is a power plant relevant size machine that will demonstrate our approach to fusion, and is sort of the step before building a first fusion power plant.
Got that, Mike?
Yeah, I think that's fair. So go ahead, Dan. I'll be quiet from this point on.
You
just
sure?
be listening. Yeah, no, I love the idea that there's steps, and I mean, the 2030 is what you said is the potential for the real. You said putting electrons on the grid is how you described it to me.
Yeah. And so you can't drink yet with electrons. That was a different word.
Yeah.
No,
I can drink anyway. I'm drinking water. I'm about to go to an award ceremony for 13-year-old kids. So
no, what we are working on, and what a number of other private fusion companies are working on, is having first power plants that produce electricity on the grid in the first half of the next decade. The first power plant will not be an economically viable power plant, but it will be a first power plant. And from there on, you work your way down a cost curve as these things get rolled out.
Klaas, do you have any sense of how much money has been spent so far over the decades to figure this thing out? Tacky question, I know, but
how much money has been spent, I don't know. I mentioned that fusion sort of started to be taken seriously in the 70s. If you look at the period 1970 to sort of the turn of the century, so a period of 30 years,
yeah.
All fusion programs were government funded. And in that period, the key metric to get to sort of net energy gain for fusion power, the key metric followed Moore's law for about 30 years. So the performance of the experiments, the machines that were being built, sort of doubled roughly every 18 months. So the development in fusion has been phenomenal, but it was all government-funded projects with government appetites for risk. So it's still at a fairly slow pace. To give you some orders of magnitude, NIF, the Lawrence Livermore facility, laser-based fusion, is about $7-8 billion that was invested in that. In Europe, ITER is being constructed, which is the world's largest fusion experiment. That is now over $20 billion. And should be turned on towards the end of this decade. So large sums of money, whether it's 50, 100 billion, but that sort of order of magnitude I would expect.
And let's take a step back, because sorry for the tacky question. This solves a problem. And so
that's an understatement.
Yeah. Walk us through the problem that it solves, because we're kind of backed into a corner and we don't realize it, right?
Well, I see a wind farm in one of the backgrounds on the picture here. Hi, Eric. Ian Chapman, who is the chief executive of UK AEA, the UK Atomic Energy Authority, which operates JET, the largest fusion machine, tokamak fusion machine, and are currently preparing for a first power plant, which should be operational towards the end of the 30s. When he talks about fusion and to frame the challenge, he puts up slides that look at sort of energy consumption right now that we as civilization have. If you look at sort of today, we consume in terms of fossil inputs about the equivalent of 11 gigatons of oil. And in order to get to net zero by 2050, we need to decarbonize that amount of energy, 11 gigatons. Between now and 2050 is roughly, and then these are rough numbers, 11,000 days, which means 11 gigatons is 11,000 megatons. That means that between now and 2050, when we're stated to aim to achieve net zero, we need to decarbonize about a megaton of oil every day. And a megaton of oil in energy terms is the size of a nuclear power station or one of the largest currently operating wind farms. So in order to achieve the stated goals as we as global society have, we need to commission the equivalent of a nuclear power station every day between now and 2050. So that is the scale of the challenge and the size of the prize.
So it sounds like we're going to revise that goal, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, not if fusion comes on. Let's go to Eric and then David, and I'm going to sneak out of here in the next few minutes. So Eric, why don't you jump in? One of the two Erics.
Right. Two questions. Number one, how does General Fusion's approach differ from that of Livermore and Commonwealth Fusion? And number two, how do you plan to solve the neutron problem?
Thank you for the neutron.
Thank you.
So obviously Eric knows more about this than the rest of us, so he's got a question about relative to other ones, but I'm guessing
But
you know it. So
But let me start then by first question: how do we differ from Livermore, and how do we differ from Commonwealth? And actually, Livermore and Commonwealth are probably at the opposite ends of the fusion spectrum. In order to get to fusion, there's something called the triple product, and this is probably one of the few times I'm talking a little bit about physics, which is the product of temperature, density of the plasma, the fuel, and confinement time, the amount of time you can keep it together. And the two basic approaches to fusion are inertial confinement and magnetic confinement. Livermore is inertial confinement, where you use lasers to put a lot of energy into a target for a very short period of time. So you work with a very short confinement time and a very high density, using very expensive and very powerful lasers. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have Commonwealth fusion, which is essentially a compact tokamak, which operates at low densities of the plasma with very long confinement times, and keeping all of this together in a set of magnetic fields that are produced by superconducting magnets. And that is sort of the key technology that is operating on that end. Where general fusion sits is somewhere in the middle of these two. So we don't work with super expensive lasers or superconducting magnets, but actually general fusion picked up an idea that was developed by the US Navy in the late 70s. And we use a liquid metal system to compress a plasma. So we have a plasma target that is medium density and medium confinement time. So we're not working on the nanosecond scale of laser-based or second scale of Commonwealth. We work in the millisecond scale. Our plasma is proven stable for 10 to 20 milliseconds. And we use a liquid metal system. So we have a cylinder full with liquid metal that we symmetrically compress around our magnetized target. It heats up as we compress it and gets to fusion conditions. That's what differentiates general fusion from the other approaches. The second question you had was, how do we deal with, cheers everyone, neutrons? And that is actually the reason why back in 2009, I was so intrigued and excited about general fusion, because neutrons are indeed one of the challenges for fusion. In a fusion reaction where you fuse together the two isotopes of hydrogen that you use, deuterium and tritium, you produce helium and a neutron. And most of the fusion energy is actually carried by that neutron. And in most machines, that neutron destroys the machine, and it's very difficult to capture the energy in it. In our liquid metal system, at the point of peak compression, we have over a meter of liquid metal, combination of lead and lithium, between the fusion reaction and the wall of the machine. And that does a number of things. It protects the machine, because the liquid lead lithium mix absorbs most of the energy of these neutrons before they reach the wall. It also captures the energy in the neutrons. They get slowed down in this mix, and the lithium mix heats up, and we use the heat exchanger to extract the energy from that mix. So we have protection of the wall, energy extraction. And the third thing is that once these neutrons have been slowed down enough by this mix, they get absorbed by the lithium in the mix. That lithium, once it absorbs a neutron, becomes unstable and falls apart into helium and tritium. And tritium is one of the two fuel elements that we need. So we breed in our machine the fuel as well. Those are some of the key challenges in the other approaches to fusion that are inherently solved in our machine. And by not using very expensive lasers or very expensive superconducting magnets, it is also economically viable.
Cynthia, we're going to test you on that.
So one of the things we talked about before the call, just to get off the physics topic and talk about like a timeline topic, is this the constraints here, the supply constraints are forward-looking investments and resources kind of given to these projects. So, but you also mentioned that there's faster creating processes being done as well. So it almost feels like the world is being split into like the kind of micro fusion, for lack of a better phrase, versus kind of a larger scale project. Can you talk about the two differences and how you see them being used?
Well, before the call, we talked about the different approaches to fission. So in fusion, most people are working on a timeline where, like us, we're building our next big machines, which will not yet be power plants, in the second half of this decade, and then build first power plants the first half of the next decade. What we talked about was fission, and in fission there are small modular reactors that people are working on. Those can potentially be deployed more quickly if you work with sort of existing proving technology.
So can I ask a quick question about if this is the future of sustainable energy? Why? I was reading earlier that it's really difficult to achieve commercial scale. So is it really difficult because historically there has been a lack of incentives, so the technology has been slow, or is it just physically, chemically, neutronically impossible to solve the equation? I mean, what's the biggest challenge here to get commercial scale so that we can all be using this?
I think the sort of, for a long time, the imperative sort of was fluctuating. In the 70s, as I mentioned, oil crisis, looking at alternative sources of energy. Then for a long time, when the oil prices came down again, you saw that the investment in the space slowed down. It is, in terms of physics and engineering, it is challenging, but I think the need for carbon-free baseload electricity is higher than ever. I think that's also becoming clear. And the other sort of enabling elements are, and as an example, ITER, the big project in the south of France, was essentially designed 20 years ago, which means it's designed with conventional superconducting magnets, not with high temperature superconducting magnets, because they didn't exist. And essentially why you have a proliferation of private fusion companies right now is we're all building off this public body of knowledge that was developed over decades with taxpayer money, but high-speed computing, 3D printing, superconducting magnets, all these technologies that enable designs that may not have been viable 20 years ago are now all becoming viable. And so you see very different types of approaches that people are pursuing because it is possible now.
What surprised me about the news on December 5th was that it frankly seemed like it was such a surprise to the experts. And that may sound naive, so forgive me on that one. My question though is, has it been repeated, since then? And
well, maybe for everyone's benefit, the news on December the 5th was the announcement at NIF, Sir Lawrence Livermore, the National Ignition Facility, that they had achieved what I think people generally refer to as scientific net gain and plasma burn. So first time that there has been a fusion reaction where the amount of energy produced by the fusion reaction was more than the amount of energy going into that fusion reaction to make it start. I don't think it came as a surprise for the people in the industry. This, let's say, is in line with what this program has been about all along. Knew that they are working on it. I think what is important about it validates scientific models that underlie the experiments. it validates that for the first time we have now created a reaction that produces in a controlled way more energy than is put in. And when I say scientific net gain, it means that the amount of energy going into the reaction is more than what came out. What it doesn't do is the fact that the lasers that originally produced the energy lose about 99% of their energy before it hits the target. So on a systems basis, it is far away from net gain, but on a sort of at the boundaries of the experiment, it is net gain. I think in the industry, this is something that was expected, and I think it would have been bigger news if it had not happened than actually now that it happened.
So I got played a little bit by the 60 Minutes episode, because it seemed to me that they had it all set up for December 5th to take place, and that people were surprised that it was successful on that date.
Well, that may have been the case. It is an experiment that they run regularly. They dial a lot of different knobs for this experiment. So maybe the fact that it happened on that date was a surprise, but I think the fact that this program yielded that result is not a surprise.
So, but having been successful once, would you not assume that somebody tried to do it again, like shortly thereafter? And I'm surprised that we haven't heard. No, I mean,
yeah, but a few things are important to understand. It is still very difficult, and there were a few publications. I think The Economist was one of them that wrote about this experiment afterwards and said it's great for sort of the whole fusion space that this happened and that they achieved net gain, but to convert this approach to fusion to a power plant, which is what we're ultimately after, is still a very, very complex path. First of all, it is scientific net gain, not net gain on a systems basis, but also to do this in a way where you can repeat it. And I think they need to repeat it 10 times a second if you would want to turn this into a power plant, where you have a target that gets destroyed, which you need to replace, and you need to capture the energy coming out of it. This is very far removed from a power plant. So in that sense, to repeat it quickly does not add that much. I think what they're doing is studying the data to understand which parameters they tuned, how that relates to the outcome, and then do it again, trying to further improve the parameters of the experiment.
We were talking offline earlier this week a little bit about the company, General Fusion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you may have made a joke about how many folks in the industry you employ in Canada. Talk to us a little bit about General Fusion as a company.
Yeah, so Michel Laberge, the founder of General Fusion, plasma physicist by training, PhD in plasma physics. He had developed technology in the printing industry, commercialized it successfully. Company got acquired by Kodak, and sort of around his 40th birthday, he decided he did not want to continue to work on a technology that destroyed trees and turned it into junk mail that he got on his doorstep every day. So he always jokes that his midlife crisis was not buying a sports car, but was doing fusion. So that's the origins of the company. And Michel researched a lot of approaches to fusion, got a few local business angels willing to back him with a few $100,000 to do a proof of principle. He dusted off this old idea called Linus, which was the US Navy idea. And actually, with those few $100,000 in a garage on one of the islands of Vancouver, he developed a proof of principle that this approach might work. On the back of that, he and the angels around him went out and raised this first round of funding that I referred to in 2009. So that was the first institutional round. At that point in time, it literally was 5 people in a big empty warehouse in Burnaby, sort of half an hour from downtown Vancouver. And from there, in 2019, we raised the E round. So all in all, this company over its history has raised around $300 million in equity and non-dilutive, mainly government money. Pre-pandemic, it employed 60 people. Today, it employs about 200. We've just relocated to a new facility very close to Vancouver Airport. We'd outgrown our facility, and also some of the experiments we want to do, we really need to be on an industrial site rather than a site for light industrial use. Not so much because of the fusion work we do, but more from an industrial safety perspective. So 200 people today, that's the amount of funding we have raised. In our investor syndicate, we have groups like Temasek and GIC from Singapore. We have BDC from Canada. We have a number of funds out of the US. We have Segra, which is sort of a nuclear-focused hedge fund in our cap table, but also Synovis, and the name that the press always latches on to is Jeff Bezos, who backed us in 2011.
Them be some deep pockets, and you need them. So
I think Ray had a question. Should we let Ray?
Yeah,
and
absolutely,
I see Lily
Ray.
has a question. You want to come in, Ray?
Yep. Thanks, guys. My question was, it was kind of going back. I put my hand down because it seemed like we were kind of moving on from this particular topic, but it seems like many of these fusion, however you're creating these very quick, it's like a point reaction. If you look at any commercial power plant, I mean, if it's a wind farm, the blades are spinning, or it's a nuclear fission plant, that reaction is just kind of ongoing. Is it with fusion, even when it's commercialized, that it will be just a series of like point, you create fusion, you harvest the energy, and then it's just like a series of shots? Or is there a thought that there may be an ability to create like a continuous process like most other power plants use?
If you look at sort of inertial confinement, so what NIF is doing, you would look at a series of short pulses that would create fusion. That's the only way you can create that type of confinement. If you look at tokamaks or stellarators, which is a different geometry for the plasma, those are generally looking at steady state operations or longer steady state operations. So that's closer to what you're describing. In our case, we normally refer to our approach to fusion as sort of the diesel engine of fusion. So we have a pulse system where a little bit of fuel gets burned, but what that fuel burn does, it heats up the liquid metal. And so with a pulsed machine, the fusion reactor is a short pulse, but heating up of the liquid metal, that going through a heat exchanger and then having a steam turbine run on the back of it, turns sort of the back end of the machine very much into a traditional power plant, just with a different heat source at the front end.
No, makes sense. Thank you.
Lily, you want to jump in?
mute, Lily.
You're on mute.
Lily, you're on mute. You're on mute. Still on. Oh, there you go.
Okay, all right. My brother-in-law is a nuclear engineer with the Navy. He has since retired, and he said that there doesn't seem to be a lot of interest from university to promote nuclear engineering program. Do you find that to be true going forward?
Well, Lily, that question relates a little bit back to what Dan was referring to earlier. If you look in let's say at Canada, where General Fusion is based, I think we employ nearly all the fusion scientists in Canada today. There is no sort of national fusion program. We are more or less Canada's fusion program, and employ everyone in that space. If you look at the country where I'm based, the UK, the average nuclear engineer in this country is in his because nearly all of them are men, in his early 60s. And that is because this country has not built a new nuclear power station for a very, very long period of time. And actually, when you talk about, or when I talk about supply chain The other supply chain we all need to talk about is people. And actually, we've had conversations with the provost of Oxford University and Nottingham, where some of the nuclear engineering programs in the UK are, is also how can we attract talent into this industry, give them a career perspective, because indeed it is a challenge. But I think the tide is slowly changing.
My second question, am I allowed to ask the second question? Some of the, like Fukushima, the nuclear accident that happened there, or even 3 Mile Island, right, a long time ago, will they ever be able to bring those facilities and modernize it and reuse it at this point? Or do they just have to tear it down and build completely new facilities?
In the case of Fukushima, I don't know. I think the cleanup there is still a very lengthy project. When you look at fusion, there are a few very big differences, and we didn't really cover that. But a fusion reaction cannot run away. I refer to our machine as a diesel engine. If you don't compress the fuel, nothing happens. And so there is no risk of a runaway reaction. The amount of fuel in one of our power plants is also very limited, because we essentially generate it on site real time. So the amount of inventory of nuclear material in our power plant is very limited. And so when you take that into account, and we're in discussions with regulators in the UK, in Canada, in the US, and in Singapore about how do you regulate this. And the UK is probably leading in that area, and saying we want to go back to first principles and really look at this more from industrial safety rather than from a nuclear risk. We often refer to the fact that in one of our machines, the amount of sort of nuclear material is comparable to the average hospital. So it's an entirely different proposition from a risk perspective. And instead of talking about reusing sort of nuclear sites, what you see is here in the UK, when discussions are ongoing about building new nuclear power plants, typically they look at locations of existing nuclear power stations, because the licensing is already there for nuclear activity, and they try to work within the licenses that have already been granted. When you look at the UK's government program, STEP, which is a spherical tokamak for energy production, that's what the acronym stands for. That machine is going to be built on the site of a current coal-fired power station, where they actually will retain the back end and replace the heat source. So I think for fusion, that is a far more likely path for deployment, to replace existing fossil infrastructure rather than look at nuclear.
Klaas, I wanted to ask you, I was listening yesterday to a discussion on, it was actually about electrical vehicles, and one of the arguments was that a lot of this clean energy conversation is aspirational, because a lot, like when it comes, for example, to EV batteries, all the raw materials it requires, there's actually not enough supply out there to really support all of the plants that people are talking about building, all of the manufacturing. So is there some kind of supply constraint on the fusion energy side, something that makes this more aspirational than achievable at scale?
I don't think so. If you look at the facility sort of behind me that we're building here in the UK, it is concrete, it is steel, it has a set of capacitors. But if you think about the amount of raw materials that need to go into energy production, this is actually probably the technology that is, in terms of supply chain and raw materials, probably the energy technology that is easiest to scale. So I don't think that will be the sort of in terms of raw materials. Yes, there is supply chain issues, particularly around sort of large metal forging and those things that needs to be built out. But I don't think in terms of the materials that go into the machine that is a constraining factor.
So Dan, before you jump in, I'll ask one more question, then I'll let you take over, which is, we were touching earlier, which is just the idea of, I guess, geopolitical impact. And, you know, when you think about energy independence, it is a huge theme in the US. So what does energy independence, or the whole world order around energy that today we know from a fossil fuel perspective, what does that look like in a fusion energy future?
Well, in principle, our machines can be built anywhere. So there are very few geographical restraints around building our machines. So I think in that sense, and that's also why there's interest from places like Japan, from South Korea, where there is no natural access to energy. That actually this is a source that would create more of a level playing field in terms of energy. How that plays out geopolitically, I think if you look at fission as the proxy, there are multiple different designs of fission power plants. Canada has the CANDU reactor. The US has a fission power plant design. Russia has a fission power plant design. China has a fission power plant design. So expectation is that in fusion, probably something similar will happen. There's no reason why a single design would win and others won't. So I think you'd see more a evolution of this sector into power plant designs that may be regional, but in principle, there's nothing that let's say ties you to certain geographies or ties you to certain regions. Not sure whether that answers your question, but
yeah, I guess we don't have to drill for anything. So in theory, it's a more level playing field, right?
When I'm thinking about all this, maybe this is too macro, but maybe it's really not. It's such a long journey ahead, right? I know you've come very far. I guess, you know, in the next year to 5 years, you know, or 3 years really, because in 5 years, what's behind you will be built. What are the hurdles that we will be looking forward to where we can say, hey, Klaas, my friend, is doing really, really well, right? He's gotten over the regulatory hurdle, or he's gotten, you know, equipment shipped, or what are the things that we can look forward to, not necessarily general fusion, but just for the marketplace?
Yeah, and I think it is around sort of, as I said earlier, we want to build this machine. What we're doing is there is a plasma injector and there is a compression system on this machine. What is in our plans is to build the plasma injector for this machine first, on site in the UK. So that one needs to be constructed, needs to be commissioned, and needs to deliver the performance that it needs to deliver. So that is an interim step. The building needs to be put together. We're now at a stage where we have planning permission for this facility in South Oxfordshire. 2 of our UK competitors are going to be our neighbors, so we're all being together on the Fusion campus in the UK. And I think other companies will have similar milestones and roadmaps. In the case of in the tokamak space, what people publish is the superconducting magnets that they're designing. What sort of performance do they get out of the magnets that they are designing? So you'll see those sorts of things. We have a compression system at small scale using currently just water, not liquid metal, where we work on shaping the collapse that we need in the machine. So those are things we're developing in parallel. And it is, I think, those sorts of things that you should be looking for. It's the component technologies that are maturing, that are delivering the performances that they need to deliver. But we're all working towards is actually putting all those things together in integrated machines. And that is, I think, what you'll see the second half of this decade.
And is this a kind of scenario where if one of your competitors gets a little bit ahead of you, it's actually a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because it means that the technology is evolving.
Exactly. So NIF, which is sort of a government program and not really a power plant, the fact that they sort of make the progress that they have been working on, I think helps everyone in the industry. The fact that a First Light Fusion, one of the UK companies working on some sort of inertial confinement, when they announced that their machine was producing neutrons, I have to say it once more.
Thank you.
When their machine was producing neutrons, that still helps the overall industry. That's also why, let's say, the industry has teamed together in the Fusion Industry Association to promote the industry at this stage. What we're competing for is dollars and talent, but other than that, we're working together on awareness, public understanding, on regulation, on supply chains, etc.
Yeah. Well, we're thrilled that you came on, Klaas, and educated everybody.
Did I educate or confuse people?
You educated.
And
There
confused, and
some
then
confusion.
re-educated.
Yeah. I put some stuff in the chat. I hope everybody saw it. And if you didn't, feel free to reach out to me and I'll send you some more links. And you're okay, Klaas, if people have follow-up questions?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the chat. You put my my email address in there. Anyone who wants to follow up, feel free to reach out. Always happy to talk about Fusion. It's so important.
It is.
Yeah, maybe as we wrap, we could ask, from your personal perspective, what do you think is the most exciting? What gets really excited about this space, other than solving the neutron challenge, everybody? Last sip. But also, what's the biggest hurdle that worries you the most? What are the opposites here?
Well, the biggest, like many things, I think fusion will happen. It's a question of when it will happen, but I'm convinced it will happen. It would be very nice if General Fusion were one of the sort of first people to make it happen. But what I really hope is that fusion happens, because as mankind, we need fusion to work. And whether it happens early 30s or the back half of the 30s, I don't think is ultimately that relevant. I see fission as a transition technology, because the moment fusion works, I don't think we need fission anymore, because fusion has all the benefits but none of the drawbacks of fission. So I think we could accelerate this, and I have occasionally referred to the pandemic and what we did as a world in terms of developing a vaccine during the pandemic. And that was throw all sorts of traditional constraints out of the window. In terms of money is no issue. We throw as much money at the problem as we can. Regulation was changed, so we don't have to do the normal clinical trials that we need to do. We go into commercialization. Government steps in, indemnifies producers. And what I sort of, given the overall benefits, I mean, in spite of the war in Ukraine today, the US, China, Japan, South Korea, the EU, Russia are still all working together on ITER in the south of France. What I hope is that that does not fracture. I think this is too important for mankind, for planet Earth, that we sort of keep working together to solve this puzzle, and also that we find ways to make this available everywhere. Our Dutch Minister of the Environment back in the 80s said the best thing we can do in Holland, the highest marginal impact for every euro or guilder in those days spent for our environment is actually spent on coal-fired power stations in Poland. because most of our pollution comes from there. And I'd like to end sort of on that note, that this is something that we collectively need, and hope that we collectively continue to work on it rather than fragment too early.
Well, that's a beautiful place to end. Want to wrap it up, Dan?
Yep. Wrap it up, everybody. Thank you very much. Klaas, again, thank you. I'll look for your
Welcome.
wife around Quag.
She's there. I spoke with her just before.
Okay. Well, good.
Thanks everybody for joining
you,
us.
everybody.
Always a pleasure to see everyone. We'll see you next week. And we don't know who the guest is next week, or I don't know. We'll let you guys know.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye everybody.
Bye, everyone.